Hi everybody, in this video we're going to learn how to create a pulsing circle animation similar to what you're seeing below. Now an animation like this has gotten pretty common over the years. You've seen it one-off on various websites and web apps, but I most recently saw it as part of setting up my Nest thermostat. The setup screen on my iOS app happened to have this kind of animation going in the background, and I thought it was actually really cool, a cool way to highlight something that is very subtle but adds a level of visual polish that you may not always expect. So in this video, we'll go deeper and learn how to build an example exactly like this. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go and, we saw an example of it. Let's go into slides and take a look at a high level on how exactly we're going to build this. Now the reason why I like to do this is the important part is of course the HTML and the CSS and any JavaScript needed to pull this example off. But I think a bigger part of it is really the problem solving angle of it. When we see an animation like this, what are the steps that we need to think about in deconstructing it into its smaller pieces? And that is an important skill that will carry forward for a variety of other animations or any problem you'll be trying to solve. So we're going to exercise that particular part of this problem solving muscle and look at a high level how we're going to approach solving this animation, and then we'll jump into code and actually build it. So what's really going on? So when you're watching the circle animation and it's pulsing, there's a continuity. We'll see that one circle appears, it disappears, another one is already within view, and it's continuing to just cycle through this really nice, repetitive cycle, which is very soothing. And the way this is done is by animating several circles in sequence. And so the sequence looks like this. Imagine we have only a single circle. When a circle starts off, it appears at a much smaller size than it needs to be, and it's fully visible. To use a more technical term, its opacity is set to 1. And as a circle gets bigger, the opacity slowly starts decreasing. So it's physically getting larger, but it's getting more and more transparent. And at the point it's almost fully done with animation, the circle is much larger and it's also barely visible. And it continues until its visibility goes completely down to 0. So it starts off fully visible and solid, and as it gets bigger, it expands and completely disappears. Now the thing to kind of notice is that this is a cycle. The circle reaches maximum size and fully fades out of view, and the process immediately starts over from just the beginning. So when we have just a single circle, you can imagine that it's going to look a little unnatural. You'll see a single circle getting really large and slowly fading out, disappearing, and then suddenly starting back up again, where it starts off very small and keeps expanding. And it becomes less of a pulsing effect and just something that's very, very odd looking. So the solution is to add more circles. So we had one more circle. You can imagine that one circle is at a different stage in its animation life, where it's starting off at the very beginning, as the case of circle 1, and circle 2 is nearing the end of its animation, and you can see it's much larger and also faded out. And if we add more circles, you can kind of see this pattern replicating, where each circle will be slightly staggered to have a different point in its life that will be seen on our screen, but the same thing our circles are doing, we've replicated across each circle. Like no circles make something very unique, it's just doing the same exact animation, just at different stages in its lifestyle. And that's the part that is kind of interesting to note about this animation, is that even though the final animation is made up of 4 circles, each circle animates in exactly the same way. The start times are staggered, and to visualize that differently, here's a way of looking from a timeline point of view. Imagine we have 3 loops that are currently going on, and you can see that each circle is essentially doing the exact same thing, but the starting time of where in the loop each circle is different. So circle 1 starts first, and on the quarter point of circle 1's life, circle 2 starts, circle 3 starts later, and circle 4 starts a little bit later after that. And then when we're watching them all together, you can imagine you can see all 4 circles kind of seeing at the same time, and the pulsing effect becomes more apparent because each one's a different level of transparency and it's in a different Z order, so we can see that effect really coming into life. Now that's a very high level overview of how we're going to approach solving this problem. Now all that remains is to translate what we looked at in slides and words and text into sweet HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Well, there's no JavaScript in this example, it's just HTML and CSS, but you can imagine if there's JavaScript involved, it'll just be a part of bringing the ideas that we talked about to life. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into VS Code. What I have here is a blank page. Nothing interesting going on here. It's called pulsing circles video.htm, and I have the exact same page open in the browser tiled to the right hand side of my screen. And so the first thing I'm going to do, as always, is start from a blank slate. I like to always start from a blank application because it gives you a better feel for how to build these examples. Now, sometimes we will start from a starting point like on CodePen, but in this case, just create a blank document, and you can use the exclamation mark shortcut in VS Code to get a boilerplate HTML page up and running. So let me change the title of it to be called Pulsing Circles Animation. Save. And then we refresh this page to see the title update. Good. I always like to do that just to make sure that the page I'm editing is the same as the page that I'm currently seeing on screen. So the first thing I always like to do, especially when it comes to these kind of examples, is start with the HTML. Now you can always start with the CSS first, but I want to start with the HTML structure that I'm going to be going with. So the first thing I'm going to have is a div. It's going to have value, and it's going to have an ID value of outer container. So outer container. And notice that I'm placing it in the body element. And within this will be a container called, well, simply container. So another div element. So we have a nested div within it. And within this container element will live both the circles and the element that's going to be in the foreground. In this case, it's going to be the logo of the Group.com orange. So I'm going to create a div class equals item. And inside this item will be an image. Image source equals, and you can use any image you want, but if you need one that's handy, you can go and use the one that I have, group.com/images/orange.png. The trusty orange that's been around for a very long time. So when I refresh this page, you can now see the orange appearing. It's a little pixelated because it's a PNG and I haven't specified a maximum size for it, and that's okay for now. And then the next item I have is div class equals circle. Just a single element that will ultimately be a circle that we're going to be having on our particular page. Let me close the quotation mark there and refresh the page. Okay, nothing is visible. So now that we have our basic HTML defined, it's kind of a good time to add some basic styling so that this starts to look like the page we ultimately want to have. So I'm going to go ahead and add my style tag in the head element. And let me look at my notes here. Yep, I'm going to go to body. First, let's make sure the display to be grid. Place content center. And that's it. There's nothing extra I want to do here. If I refresh this page, nothing really happens, of course, because, well, the image kind of shifted to the center, but that's okay. It's a large image, so we won't see anything there. So now let's go ahead and style our container, the div ID element that houses both this image and the circle element as well. So hashtag container. Now I'm using hashtag because the div is an ID value. You can also have it be a class value if you want. There are pros and cons to it, but you can imagine that the ID value is always convenient if you're doing stuff in JavaScript later on, which in this example I'm not going to, but I do have a more elaborate example, which I may record a video on later where I will show that. And so that's why there's a hashtag and an ID value instead. So let's have a width of 600 pixels for our container element and a height of 400 pixels. And again, let's make this a display grid. Place items, center, and we'll set overflow to hidden so that if any element becomes bigger than the container, it's okay. And set its position to relative as well. And then similarly, let's go ahead and style our circle element, which is going to basically be just a simple circle. Border radius is 50%. This is what makes it a circle actually. It says border radius. It's a DOM element. And so an easy way to make it a circle is to give it a fixed width and height, width 150 pixels, height 150 pixels, and a background color of deep blue sky. Or sorry, deep sky blue, not deep blue sky, deep sky blue. And then position absolute, opacity 0. Actually, let's leave it, I'll leave it 0 for now, but I'll change it to 1 to show you what happens. But the initial starting point of our circle is going to be invisible. And then the last two stylers we're going to add for now is going to be our dot item. I'm giving it a little space here just to separate it from the rest of our items here. Z index of 100, padding of 5 pixels, and the image itself, which is our orange logo, dot item image width equals 150 pixels. All right, let's refresh this page and let's see what's going on here. All right, everything so far seems to be in good shape. Let's give it a background just to make sure everything looks good. Background color on our container of hashtag EEE. Is it 600 by 400? Yep, I'm zoomed in a bit, so if I zoom out, you can see that it is all appropriately sized. All right, so we'll take the background color off for now. And also I mentioned a circle has an opacity of 0. If I'm given an opacity of 1, you'll sort of see it appear behind the circle. So, we have all of our elements appropriately styled for what we're doing right now to look okay. So now what I want to do is I want to animate this circle. We want to have an animation. And so it seems like, a good point to have the one circle we have start from where it is, get larger, and then disappear. Just like the first part of the slides we looked at when we looked at what it will take to animate a single element. And so for that, we're going to actually rely on a CSS animation. So animation, scale in is the name of the keyframes. 4 seconds is how long the animation is going to run. It's going to run forever, infinite. And I have an easing function defined, cubic Bezier, and 0.36, 0.11, 0.89, and 0.32. Now, you don't have to be this specific. You can choose any kind of animation you want, but this one I felt mimics a nice natural feel where it starts slow, speeds up, and then it slows down again for fading away, which makes it feel more natural. So 0.36, 0.11, 0.89, and 0.32 are the point values for our cubic Bezier timing function. All right, so just by specifying the animation property, we don't get much. The next step is to actually define the keyframes, which are in this case are called scale in, that actually do the animation itself. So from, it's going to be a transform, scale 0.5, 0.5, so it's going to start off at 50% of its width and height, and it's going to have an opacity of 0.5. It's the starting point, and then the final value, which I'm using 2. You can use 0% and 100% for the from and to keyframes respectively. But I like to use from and to because it's simpler. We only have 2 keyframes. It makes it much natural to read about it as well. Transform, scale, increase it by 250%, 2.5, 2.5, and an opacity of 0. All right, let's refresh this page and see what we will be seeing here. You can now see our circle starting up slowly and over a period of 4 seconds, getting larger, appearing, and disappearing. So not too bad. This is kind of what we were looking for, but we wanted to have it be across multiple circles, right? And the way to do that is we have a div class circle. We can now go ahead and create 1, 2, 3, 4 circles, which is how many we wanted. So if I refresh this page right now, you'll now see our circles appear. Now notice that this circle looks much bolder than what we saw earlier. And the reason is that we now have 4 circles all stacked on top of each other like pancakes who are now playing the same animation. So even though the opacity starts off at 0.5, it's actually starting off at 2, which doesn't make sense. 1 is the maximum you can get, but that's what's basically being layered on top of. And so the way we're going to fix this is by staggering our animation. We talked earlier about having each animation start at a different time. And so let's go ahead and do that. And the way we do that is by using the animation delay property. And we want to set it on each element individually. So instead of specifying it globally where each element will get the same delay, we want to give each element its own delay that doesn't get overridden by another element, which means that we have to set an inline style. So style equals animation delay. And in this case, I'm going to do 0 seconds. We'll start with just like a positive value just for now, and then I'll explain why I'm going to change that in a moment. So 0 seconds, I'm going to copy this to our value 3, 4 times, and I'm going to change it from 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so now let's refresh this page. And notice that now you see 1 circle, 2 circles, 3 circles, all appearing appropriately. And this looks exactly like the pulsing animation that we were trying to create from the very beginning. But there is a catch though. Let me refresh this page one more time and you will see it. Notice the starting point. We're starting off the animation, each time I refresh, for example, from a blank slate. Maybe this is the effect you want, but for a real effect, you kind of want to be in a situation where when you load the page, the animation looks like it's already been running, it's already going on, so it doesn't look like you're starting from the very beginning. And the way to solve that is actually by continuing to fiddle with the animation delay property. So instead of starting from 0 seconds, I'm actually going to start from a negative value instead, which is the equivalent of kind of having something run and then going backwards from there. So I'm going to start from negative 3 seconds for the first one. I'm going to go negative 2 seconds on the second item, negative 1 second, and we'll do this in 0 seconds. So it's going to be starting off without any extra value. All right, now let me refresh the animation, and here's what you're going to see. Notice that when I refresh the animation this time around, each animation is starting off from a different point in its life cycle, and not from the very, very beginning. And so when each time I refresh, you'll now see that we are starting from a pretty midpoint, so that the animation just naturally feels like it's always been running and it's just running continuously from there. And so we now have our full pulsing animation effect running pretty nicely, exactly the way we had intended to. And so that's really the high level of both the idea of how to take 4 circles, how to give them the same animation, and how to use animation delay to stagger the starting point to give us this effect that we see here. And then we also looked at the HTML and CSS needed to bring the effect to life. Now, the most challenging part of all these animations is oftentimes not the HTML and CSS. It's often about taking a step back and thinking about how can we deconstruct this in light of the limitations that HTML and CSS have in general in terms of what animations can and cannot do. And once we kind of have both of those sides figured out, all that remains is just putting the pieces together and coming up with a solution that works really well. And in this case, I think the final effect really reflects the same as what we might see in other versions of the example, and it definitely matches almost pixel for pixel the animation I saw when I was setting up my Nest device, where the setup screen had the exact same effect. So feel free to experiment with this version of the animation, try different things out, and share what you created in the forums. I'm always curious to see what's going on. So speaking of the forums, if you have any questions or you want to share something you created or a modification you made, post in the forums at forum@krupa.com, where I and others would be very happy to help you out with your web development questions, front-end questions, animation questions, or just questions. So feel free to drop by and check it out. And in terms of next steps, tell your friends and enemies all about it. If you like this video, hit subscribe to be notified of new video content that I post regularly. Follow me at Krupa on Twitter, where I post bite-sized updates on web development topics, new content, and so on. But I'm also semi-active on Facebook and other places where @Krupa is active and I'm the person that it represents. Check if you also enjoy reading content in terms of both paperback or Kindle versions of it. Guess what? I've happened to have written a handful of books, and maybe more books available by the time you see this video, where I cover a variety of interesting front-end topics. Especially if you like animation, I have a book published by O'Reilly called Creating Web Animations. Link to all the books below in the video as well, so check it out. And with that, we'll see you all next time.